going to share a brief testimony before she does. Thank you, Frances.
Good morning. About 14 years ago, I started therapy to deal with some childhood trauma. As a result of that, I started to drink. I'd had a drinking problem previously, but I hadn't drunk for 36 years. I started drinking again. And through 12-step programs run by Christians, God set me free 4 years ago today. I just want to give God the glory for that. It was him that did it, not me. Anyway, I'm going to read Hebrews 5:5-10. In the same way, Christ did not take on himself the glory of becoming a high priest, but God said to him, "You are my son. Today I have become your father." And he says in another place, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered. And once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, and was designated by God to be the high priest in the order of Melchizedek.
Thank you, Frances. Not going to read it in Spanish, no? Maybe next time. Wonderful. That's a great testimony, isn't it? And we've sang about that freedom, and Alan shared about that. So we just thank God for that, and we ask for more in every individual's life of his wonderful freedom. John H. King was an Anglican vicar who was imprisoned in a German prisoner of war camp in 1940. He spent 5 years attending the needs of his flock in that prisoner of war camp in the most horrendous conditions imaginable. Throughout his time as a prisoner of war, he kept diaries. In those diaries, he tells of an Australian soldier called Tom Moore. Tom was in charge of the Australian barrack, which meant that he was responsible both to the German authorities for the state of the barrack and to the Australians for representing the interests of the men. King writes, "The authorities expect him to see their displeasure when anything is wrong with the state of the barrack or the behavior of the men. On the other hand, the men look to him to champion their rights and liberties, real and imagined. To carry out the job efficiently and to retain the confidence of both sides is a rare achievement, but Tom succeeded." Tom spent most days going back and forth between Germans and Australians and the other leading figures in the camp, making sure that everything was sorted out despite the appalling conditions, and he won universal respect. This is the third part in our sermon series, digging into the book of Hebrews. And we've titled the series, "Jesus is Better." I've called it that because the book of Hebrews could be summed up in that one simple phrase: Jesus is better. So far, we've seen the author argue that Jesus is better than angels. Last week, we considered the argument that Jesus is better than Moses. This week, the assertion is that Jesus is better than the Old Testament priests. So priesthood is a key theme in the book of Hebrews. I've mentioned it a couple of times already. And in the first verse that we read last week from chapter 3, it mentions that Jesus was the apostle and the high priest. And I mentioned that that notion of high priest is the representative, God's representative, like a bridge between God and humankind, representing both interests. Somewhat like Tom Moore between the Germans and the Australians. Obviously, the example doesn't quite match because, we're not suggesting that any particular party takes the role of the Nazis or anything like that, but you can see the illustration kind of playing out, that representative between two. That's the role of the high priest, to represent God to man and man to God. And from the end of chapter 4 right up until right up unto chapter 10, priesthood, in particular Christ's credentials as the high priest, better than any before him, or in fact the ultimate high priest, is a primary feature. The big chunk of Hebrews focuses on this concept of the high priest. So that's what we're going to be dwelling on today. We're not going to take it all on today. It's going to be a feature as we continue to explore the book of Hebrews. But in order to understand the concept of priesthood, we need to understand the role of priests in the Old Testament. The ancient Israelites had earthly priests, the representative. They went before God on behalf of the people. We can read about the beginnings of this system in Leviticus chapter 16, where we find that God gives instruction to Aaron, the high priest, via Moses. In brief, it looks like this. So once a year, there is a day of atonement that takes place in the holy place. The high priest is to enter that holy place. God said to Moses to pass on that you can't just come into that space anytime you want. I'm going to dedicate a particular day to do that. Once a year, the Day of Atonement. In order for Aaron to be able to approach that holy place or to enter that holy place, he has to be clean. And to be clean, he has to bathe in a particular way and to dress in a particular way, in robes. And it's very, very specific. The detail is in Leviticus 16. But not only that, he has to offer his own sacrifice for his own sin. In order to enter, he has to be clean. And a ram is burnt as a burnt offering. The bull is a sacrifice for his own sin, the ram is the burnt offering. Once he's done that, he is clean enough to enter. But first, 2 male goats are offered. They're taken from the Israelite community. One will be chosen by God as the goat to be sacrificed as a burnt offering, which is one half of the sacrifice. The other will be sent into the desert as the atonement. This goat is the scapegoat. It carries the sins of the community away from the community. So here are 3 things that help us understand why the sacrificial system was instigated, and crucially why it was and still is an integral process. And I'll explain a little bit why it still is an integral process, even though we don't see rams and bulls and stuff roaming around waiting to be slaughtered and laid on the stage. Thank goodness for that, in so many ways, carpet, etc. But there's 3 ways why it was instigated, and I'm going to pop them on the screen if you wouldn't mind. The first is to let everyone know that forgiveness is costly. Everybody needs to know that in order to be forgiven, there has to be a cost. And the sacrificial system reminds us that it's costly. The second reason why it was instigated is to let everyone know that the punishment for sin is death. So every time an animal is sacrificed in order to atone for the sins, we're reminded that the punishment for sin is death. And the third reason is to make it absolutely clear that without the shedding of blood, there can be no remission of sin. So we need to let everyone know that forgiveness is costly. We need to let everyone know that the punishment for sin is death. And we need to make it absolutely clear that without the shedding of blood, there can be no remission of sin. So those are 3 reasons why the sacrificial system was important. So whenever you read about sacrificial animal sacrifice in the Old Testament, remember it's to show you, to show me, to show us that forgiveness is costly, that the punishment of sin is death, that without the shedding of blood, there can be no pardon for our sin. Is that okay? We're clear on that? So put a pin in that for a second. Keep that in mind, and let's consider again the role of the high priest. So Jews who were the readers of this book, the book of Hebrews, it's a letter to people who were brought up in this system. They understand this system. They've had an encounter with Jesus. They've committed to following Jesus, but there's some challenges, and there's some people are starting to drift away a little bit. We've talked about that in recent weeks. Some people are starting to draw their attention to other things. They're placing a higher place on angels and Moses, and they're just being, for a number of reasons. Perhaps it's persecution, perhaps it's just challenge, difficulties. They've decided that there is another way, that actually we're going to focus a bit more on some of the stuff that we've been brought up into. So the Jews, the readers of the book, understand this sacrificial system. They get it. So when there's talk of sacrifice in the book of Hebrews, they just don't understand. They don't need it explained to us. They don't need to do the amount of reading I've had to do in the last couple of weeks just to try and understand priestliness. Who on earth is Melchizedek? All of that sort of stuff. They just understand. They've observed it. They've practiced it since it was enacted by Moses, regularly, routinely, and ritually. They understand that they need a high priest because they can't stand before the holy God on their own merits. The term high priest is a familiar one, and it carries gravity. We can draw a high priest job description directly from the opening verses in Hebrews chapter 5. I'll just read that for us. It says, "Every high priest is selected from among men and is appointed to represent them in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sin. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he himself is subjected to weakness. This is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins, as well as for the sins of the people. No one takes this honor upon himself. He must be called by God, just as Aaron was." So thinking about those verses, 5 elements of the job description. Pop the next one up. So they're selected from among men, it says, so from humanity. So if they're to represent men and women, they need to be chosen from men and women. They understood they were part of them. So they understood what it means to be a person, what it means to have human thoughts, feelings, difficulties, challenges, joys, all of that sort of stuff. In order to represent men and women, the high priest has to be chosen from amongst that people group. So if you can imagine like a union rep in a workers' union, that person represents the workforce to the management, but they have to be chosen from the workforce. A union rep chosen from the management doesn't necessarily represent the rights of the people. The second thing is that they represent men and women in matters related to God. So one person, once a year, goes into the inner room, which is described in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 7, as the tabernacle. They go into the inner room. So that person, that representative chosen from amongst humanity, represents people to God in the inner place. The third thing is that they offer sacrifices and gifts for sins. So they had to offer sacrifice, first of all, on behalf of themselves, to acknowledge their own sinfulness and their need to have their sins taken away. And then they have to be the representative of the people to offer sacrifices for their sins. The fourth element of the job description is that they deal gently with ignorant and wandering. So this is a hands and heart thing. They understand that they are flawed every bit as much as the individuals that they're representing. It's in keeping with this outward duty. They just understand that they fall short as much as the people that they're representing fall short. So they should have some empathy. They should have some understanding. It's drawn directly from their own sense of weakness. Their own understanding of their sinfulness should give them an insight into that of others. So they should therefore be patient and kind and sympathetic towards those who are being ignorant and wandering off. It's a bit like being a parent, just trying to get it just right. We know if we're too lax with our children, that can be challenging. If we're too harsh with our children, that can be challenging too. So the high priest's role was just to try and find that middle ground between bringing direction and love and care. And then the fifth thing is that they have to be called by God. They can't self-appoint. Later on in the Bible, Herod begins appointing the high priests, and that is deeply problematic. It's not man's job to call a high priest, it's God's job. So it's a really brief overview of the role of the high priest. It's an overview of their credentials and the sacrificial system that they're responsible for. Are we still on track? I'm trying as best I can to be succinct because it's complicated. If you read the whole Bible before next week, you'll probably get a better understanding of how it all works. But with that somewhat understood, should we talk a little bit about Melchizedek? Should we have a little think about who Melchizedek is? Honestly, I'm launching an appeal to have Melchizedek as a more common name than it is. 2025 is the year of the baby top 5 names. Megan, it's not too late. Melchizedek. I say it mysterious because despite quite a few mentions in the book of Hebrews, he's only mentioned twice in the Old Testament. And very, very briefly. He's not a big feature like Abraham or Moses or Joshua or Joseph or David or Daniel. Melchizedek is only mentioned twice. Once in Genesis and once in the Psalms. He's actually mentioned significantly more times in Hebrews than at any other place in the Bible. And it comes from a place in Genesis chapter 14. And it's an encounter with Abraham. And the story goes like this. Abraham has a nephew called Lot. And Lot is taken captive and he's taken as a hostage away from his town after an attack on the town of Sodom where he was living. So the attack was instigated by 4 Canaanite kings who were bent on taking territory around the Jordan. So they seized on Sodom and they took a number of people away with them, one of whom was Abraham's nephew, Lot. On hearing about the kidnap of his nephew, Abraham mounts a rescue mission. Now, we read a lot about Abraham. Perhaps what gets lost in the stories of Abraham is that he's pretty solid. You don't mess with Abraham. He gets a group of crack commandos from amongst his own family, 318 of them, and mounts a nighttime assault, taking back his nephew and dealing with the 4 kings who dared to cross him. He's traveled all the way over to near Damascus, and in the middle of the night, they've swooped, they've overthrown the kings, they've taken back what's theirs. It's a brilliant kind of hostage story, and you kind of think Abraham's pretty hardcore. But on leading his triumphant special forces back to familiar territory, he's welcomed by this chap, Melchizedek. And he's a king of a place called Shalem. Melchizedek brings food and wine to Abraham and his crack commandos, and he blesses him. Melchizedek blesses Abraham. And intriguingly, Abraham is no ordinary king. Melchizedek is no ordinary king. Melchizedek is also a priest. Chosen by Elohim. Chosen by the same God that has chosen Abraham, that Abraham worships. He and Abraham serve the same God. What a coincidence. I say intriguingly because later on in the verses in Leviticus, remember Leviticus 16 where we get the kind of the rules? It expressly says it's forbidden for a king to be a priest. So here we have the king of Shalem, Melchizedek, is also a priest. That is important. Abraham's response to Melchizedek's blessing is to give a 10th of everything he has. That's a principle that threads all the way through the Bible and that we still hold to today. Abraham's response to this blessing is to give him a 10th of everything. So Abraham, who's God's chosen representative, if you remember your Old Testament history, God chooses Abraham as part of his big rescue mission. He's God's representative. Encounters a king priest, and recognizing this king priest's status and uniqueness, sacrifices a 10th of his possessions. That's quite interesting, isn't it? I think it is. This next bit's going to blow your mind. So Melchizedek is a king and priest of Shalem. Shalem is an ancient name for Jerusalem. Jerusalem, which will later become the capital city of Abraham's future family, where the temple is built. The 10% that Abraham gives mirrors the 10% which the Israelites will later give to honor the priests who work in the temple in Jerusalem. So here's Abraham, the father of the Israelites, and he is honoring a royal priesthood that existed long before Israel's temple or their priests. So the Leviticus stuff hasn't even happened yet. The priest stuff hasn't even happened yet. And yet we're starting to see this modeled. even before the establishing of the tabernacle. It gets wilder. Soon after this encounter with Melchizedek, we have the birth of Isaac. You remember Abraham, Isaac? You remember what happened when Isaac was young? Yeah? God calls Abraham to offer Isaac as a sacrifice to atone for his failures, to atone for Abraham's scheming. Abraham is called to surrender his and his family's future to God, and he asks him to sacrifice Isaac. It's one of those really tense, uncomfortable moments of the Bible. It's a quick reminder of what the sacrificial system reminds us of. 3 things. Forgiveness is costly. In order to get God's forgiveness, it's going to cost Abraham. The punishment for sin is death. And without the shedding of blood, there can be no pardon for sin. So if you remember the story, just as Abraham is about to sacrifice Isaac, he's told to hold it. And instead of sacrificing Isaac, a ram is provided, caught in a thicket, and is sacrificed instead of Isaac. So here we have the first signs of the sacrificial system that's to come. There needs to be an atonement for sin. There needs to be some bloodshed for the forgiveness. And it comes in the form of a ram. Now, all of this takes place on Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah, otherwise known as Shalem. Shalem, otherwise known as Jerusalem. Jerusalem, the site of the temple. Jerusalem, the center of the Jewish sacrificial system. Jerusalem, where the high priests, God's chosen representatives, would enter the holy place on the Day of Atonement to sacrifice on behalf of their community. Jerusalem, the city where Jesus would one day teach in that same temple. Jerusalem, the temple where Jesus would throw tables over. The city where Jesus would be arrested, tried, beaten, crucified, and buried. Jerusalem, the city where Jesus would appear to many, having risen again on the 3rd day. Jesus, the new temple, fully God and fully man. You see, Melchizedek's appearance in Genesis 14 isn't an incidental encounter. It's not a footnote in the Bible. Mysterious, yes. Random, not on your Nelly. Melchizedek points to Jesus. Jesus, the Messiah. Melchizedek was both king and priest at the same time. No other figure in the Bible ever held both offices until Jesus. Now, I mentioned there was one other place where Melchizedek's mentioned. He's mentioned in Psalm 110, words written by David. And that psalm is quoted. Francis has read an element of it to us because it's quoted in Hebrews. Psalm 110, the only other place where he's mentioned, tells us that it's about Jesus. It's not about Melchizedek. It's significant, it's important, but it's about Jesus. It's written a long time, Psalm 110, a long time before Jesus comes, but David identifies that this seemingly chance random encounter with Melchizedek, all the way back in Genesis 14, points to the Messiah. The symbolism, the connections. Do you remember when Matt talked a few weeks ago? He talked about the links between the Old and the New Testament and how different elements of the Bible point to each other. This is it in action. The Bible is unbelievable in a really believable kind of way. It's remarkable. You should read it all the time. The person addressed as a priest after the order of Melchizedek is a king. So seeing after the order of Melchizedek means being like Melchizedek in being both priest and king. Psalm 110 predicted such a figure, the coming Messiah. Points to Jesus. Melchizedek's name and title also pointed to Jesus. The name Melchizedek literally means king of righteousness. Shalem, the town that Melchizedek was king of, is a variant of the word shalom, which means peace. So Melchizedek is the king of peace. Both phrases are used by the prophet Isaiah. to describe the Messiah in Isaiah 9 and 11. King of righteousness, Prince of peace. All points to Jesus. Isn't that trippy? I said to Vicky I was going to use that word. She told us not to. Points to Jesus. That's wild stuff. There's bits in the Old Testament, just lines in the Old Testament that are pointing to Jesus. Because Jesus is better. He's better than the old order of things. He's better than the sacrificial things. If we're thinking about, the roots and the rights and the regulations that we have to go to find forgiveness, Jesus is better. Jesus is the high priest in the order of Melchizedek, but so much better than Melchizedek. If you remember that job description that I mentioned before, if you pop up the next one, that was the high priest job description. Selected from among humanity to represent men and women in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sin, to deal gently with the ignorant and the wandering and called by God. Jesus is the great high priest. He was selected from among humanity, chosen to represent men and women in matters related to God. He is our Tom Moore, who moves backwards and forwards between God and us to represent us. He offers gifts and sacrifices. He gave his life. And he deals gently with the ignorant and the wandering. Thank Jesus for that. Because I am so ignorant and I so often wander. And he's called by God. The three reasons for the sacrificial system remain. We don't have to participate in the sacrificial system, but the reasons still remain. If you pop those up. Forgiveness is still costly. That hasn't changed. The punishment for sin is death. That has not changed. And without the shedding of blood, there can be no pardon for our sin. But we don't need to go through the rites and the rituals once a year with bulls and rams, because Jesus did it once and forever, the great high priest. So with that in mind, I'm going to conclude by drawing us back to the last few verses of chapter 4. And while I do so, I would love for you to stand if you can. Just want to create some space for us to respond to that. Because I think one of the things that perhaps worked well in that sacrificial system when there was visual process around, I imagine there was a lot of anticipation for the Day of Atonement. We're reaching the point where we can be forgiven. We're reaching the point where we can be closer to God again. And perhaps there's a potential for us to become a bit lax about the importance of the high priest, about the role of the high priest. Perhaps we've forgotten the costliness of forgiveness. Perhaps we've discarded the reality that the punishment for sin is death. And perhaps it's been a while since we've acknowledged that without the shedding of blood, there can be no pardon for our sin. Hebrews chapter 4 from verse 14 says, "Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has gone through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a great high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he was without sin. Let us therefore approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need." We mustn't ever forget that forgiveness is costly. We mustn't ever forget that the punishment for sin is death, and that without the shedding of blood, there can be no pardon for our sin. Nor must we forget that because of the work of Jesus, the great high priest, we can boldly approach God with confidence in order to receive his grace and mercy. The need for us to offer animal sacrifice is gone. The need for repentance remains. the need to acknowledge our sinfulness and to receive his grace and mercy, which is freely given but came at a cost. So let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence. I'm going to invite us to approach the throne of grace with confidence. As we conclude our time, I just want to wait here for a moment. God, would you just come and move among us, stir our hearts and our spirits, Lord. May we bring to mind those things which compromise our relationship with you, the things that have got in the way. Would you come, Holy Spirit? And I want to just invite us to approach that throne of grace. Do so boldly. It might be that as we've been just pondering that, as we've been inviting the Holy Spirit into this moment, that something's come to mind. Perhaps just the reality of what we've talked about, and maybe there has been moments when we've just not engaged with that, or perhaps you've never accepted the reality of that. Perhaps you've never accepted Jesus as your representative. So I want to encourage you to just find some space at the front if you'd value prayer into any of that. We're not going to be intrusive. We're not going to ask you to reveal details. But that boldly approaching might just be taking a step. And you might feel like, what are people going to think when I do that? Or it feels a little bit awkward. Maybe that's the boldly bit. Because the reality is all of us fall short. All of us have the need for forgiveness daily. So if you would value, I'm just going to make a little bit more time